to kind of explain what Linux is, you have to explain what an operating system is. And the thing about an operating system is that you're never ever supposed to see it, because nobody really uses an operating system. People use programs on their computer, and the only mission in life of an operating system is to help those programs run. So an operating system never does anything on its own. It's only waiting for the programs to ask for certain resources, or ask for a certain file on the disk, or ask for the programs to connect them to the outside world. And then the operating system steps in and tries to make it easy for people to write programs.
Before there could be Linux, there was Richard Stallman and the free software movement.
I mean, think of Richard Stallman as the great philosopher, right? And think of me as the engineer.
Richard Stallman is the founding father of the free software movement. Through his efforts to build the GNU operating system, he created the legal, philosophical, and technological foundation for the free software movement. Without these contributions, it's unlikely that Linux and open source would have evolved into their current forms today.
I joined the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab in 1971. I joined a thriving community of hackers, people who loved programming, loved exploring what they could do with computers, and they had developed a complete operating system, entirely written there. And I became one of the team that continued to improve the operating system, adding new capabilities. That was my job, and I loved it. We all loved it. That's why we were doing it.
Software was just passed around between people. And I think it was only like in the late 70s, early 80s, that people started really closing up their software and saying, no, you can never get a look at the source code. You can't change this software, even if it's necessary for you to fix it for your own application. And you can actually blame some of that on Microsoft. They were one of the real pioneers of the proprietary software model.
In the mid-1970s, a group of hackers and computer hobbyists in Silicon Valley formed the Homebrew Computer Club. In the club's January 31st, 1976 newsletter, Bill Gates of the recently formed Microsoft wrote an open letter to the community where he made a point-by-point argument for the relatively new concept of proprietary software. Up to that point, the practice of computer users had been to freely pass around software with not much thought given to its ownership. Known as an open letter to hobbyists, Bill Gates writes, "To me, the most critical thing in the hobby market right now is the lack of good software courses, books, and software itself. Without good software and an owner who understands programming, a hobby computer is wasted. Will quality software be written for the hobby market?" Gates goes on to write, "The feedback we have gotten from the hundreds of people who say they are using BASIC has all been positive. Two surprising things are apparent, however. One, most of these users never bought BASIC, and two, the amount of royalties we have received from sales to hobbyists makes the time spent on Altair BASIC worth less than $2 an hour. Why is this? As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Hardware must be paid for, but software is something to share. Who cares if the people who worked on it get paid? Is this fair? One thing you don't do by stealing software is get back at MITS for some problem you may have had. MITS doesn't make money selling software. One thing you do is prevent good software from being written. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? What hobbyist can put 3-man years into programming, finding all bugs, documenting his product, and distribute it for free? The fact is, no one besides us has invested a lot of money in hobby software. What about the guys who resell Altair BASIC? Aren't they making money on hobby software? Yes, but those who have been reported to us may lose in the end. They are the ones who give hobbyists a bad name and should be kicked out of any club meeting they show up at. I would appreciate letters from anyone who wants to pay up or has a suggestion or comment. Signed, Bill Gates, General Partner, Microsoft."
In the late 70s and early 1980s, Richard Stallman was doing artificial intelligence research and coding at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab. Richard had a number of negative experiences during that period which soured him on the whole idea of commercial software.
Such as?
Some code that he wanted to work on and wanted to fix was locked up, and he couldn't get the company that owned the code to let him fix it, even though it would have been to their advantage to do so.
And that put me into a moral dilemma, you see, because to get one of the modern computers of the day, which was the early 80s, you would have to get a proprietary operating system. The developers of those systems didn't share with other people. Instead, they tried to control the users, dominate the users, restrict them, saying, if to get this system, you have to sign a promise you won't share with anybody else. And to me, that was essentially a promise to be a bad person, to betray the rest of the world, cut myself off from society, from the cooperating community. So I looked for another alternative, and I realized I was an operating system developer. If I were to develop another operating system, and then as the author encourage everyone to share it, say, everyone, you can come and get it, use this, form a new community, not only could I give myself a way to keep using computers without betraying other people, but I'd give it to everybody else too. Everybody would have a way out of that moral dilemma. And so I realized this was what I had to do with my life. I actually began the project in January of 1984. That's when I resigned from my job at MIT to start developing the GNU operating system. Now, I should explain that the name GNU is a hack because it's a recursive acronym. It stands for GNU's not Unix. You see, so the G in GNU stands for GNU. And what the name means is I was developing a system that was like the Unix operating system, but was not the Unix operating system. This was a different system. We would have to write it completely from scratch because Unix was proprietary. We were forbidden to share Unix. We couldn't use Unix. It was useless for a community. So we had to write a replacement for it. Well, Unix consisted of a large number of separate programs that communicated with each other. So we just had to replace these programs one by one. So what I started doing was writing a replacement for one program, and then another, and then another, and then people started joining me because I published an announcement inviting other people to join me to help write these programs. And by around 1991, we had replaced practically all of them.
What were some of the programs that you
Well, we had to have a complete system, you need to have a kernel, which is the program that allocates resources to all the other programs. You need a text editor, you need text formatter, you need mailers, you need lots and lots of things. There are hundreds of programs in a Unix-like operating system. The crucial thing about GNU is that it's free software. Now, free software refers not to price, but to freedom. So think of free speech, not free beer. The freedoms that I'm talking about are the freedoms to make changes if you want to, or hire somebody else to make changes for you if you're using the software for your business, to redistribute copies, to share with other people, and to make improvements and publish them so that other people can get the benefit of them too. Now, those are the freedoms that distinguish free software from non-free software. These are the freedoms that enable people to form a community. If you don't have all these freedoms, you're being divided and dominated by somebody.
Free software generally does have a copyright, it does have an owner, and it has a license.
Well, copyleft being a general idea, in order to use it, you have to have a specific example. And the specific example we use for most GNU software packages is the GNU General Public License, a particular document in legalese which accomplishes this job. A lot of other people use that same license. For example, Linus Torvalds uses that license for Linux as well. From the beginning of the free software movement, I've had the idea that there's room in it for business to be done. One of the advantages of free software is that there's a free market for any kind of service or support. So if you are using software in your business and you want good support, you have a choice of people to go to for it. With proprietary software, support is a monopoly. There's one company typically that has the source code, and only they can give you support. So typically, you're at the mercy of a monopoly. That's the case, for example, with Microsoft. So no wonder the support is so bad.
The GNU project started by building a toolkit of basic development tools such as a C compiler, a debugger, a text editor, and other necessary apparatus. And their intention was eventually to develop a kernel to sit underneath those and be the center of the operating system. By about 1990, they had successfully developed that toolkit, and it was in wide use on a great many variants of Unix, but there was still no free kernel.
The kernel happened to be one of the last things we started to do, and we had started it not long before. And that's when Linus Torvalds came along.
Linus or Linus? What's your preferred pronunciation?
When I speak Swedish, it's Linus. When I speak Finnish, it's Linus. When I speak English, it's Linus. And I really don't care how people pronounce my name. But Linux is always Linux.
He developed a kernel and got it working faster than we got ours working, and got it to work very nicely and solidly. His kernel is called Linux.
The initial goal was my very personal goal, to be able to run a similar environment on my computer that I had grown used to at the university computers. And I could not find anything that suited me for that, right? So having been doing computers for all my life, basically, at that point I just decided that I'll do my own. Most of the inspiration early on came from Sun OS, which was what I was using at the university at the time.
Which university?
University of Helsinki in Finland.
Linus used the traditional tried and true method of writing one program that does the job, and he got it to work quickly, in fact, faster than I would have thought was possible.
Operating system kernel is actually just a collection of servers that do different things, and then they have a common protocol for doing communication between themselves.
So why is it that if the GNU project had so much lead time, so to speak, doing this, why is it that he was able to kind of come in at the tail end, so to speak?
Well, we actually started the GNU herd not long before he started Linux. And as it happened, though, we chose a design that's a very advanced design in terms of the power it gives you, but also turns out to be very hard to debug. We decided to divide up the kernel, which traditionally had been one program, to divide it up into a lot of smaller programs that would send messages to each other asynchronously to communicate. And the problem is that that style of programming has a great deal of potential for bugs, which are often very hard to figure out because they depend on does this program send this message before or after this one sends that message, and the result was it took us years to get the thing to work.
What is Linux's relationship to the GNU project?
Well, there's relationships to GNU on kind of multiple levels. One is just a philosophical level of thinking that making your source open is a good idea.
When Linus developed the kernel, he wasn't doing it for the GNU project. He did it independently. And he released it independently, and we didn't know about it. But some of the people who did know about it decided to look for what else they could find to put together with that kernel to make a whole system. And they looked around, and lo and behold, everything they needed was already available. What good fortune, they thought, but actually there was no chance about it. They had found all the pieces of the GNU system, which was missing just the kernel. So when they put all that together, really they were fitting Linux into the gap in the GNU system, but they didn't know that.
There's a lot of these programs done by the Free Software Foundation and done by other people like Linux, and there's a symbiosis between Linux and the programs, so that the programs run on Linux and at the same time, and they take advantage of Linux as a platform, while Linux takes advantage of the programs by just being able to use them.
What programs?
For the main one is actually the Gnu C Compiler, which without a C compiler it would not have been possible to make Linux or most of the open programs available. Linux uses the GPL, and I agree with the kind of philosophy behind the GPL. That said, the GPL itself is not a very pretty document, which is probably just because no lawyers can ever be very pretty. I called it Linux originally as a working name, and that was just because Linus, and the X has to be there. It's Unix. I mean, it's like a law. And what happened was that I initially thought that I can't call it Linux publicly because it's just too egotistical. And that was before I had a big ego, right?
They thought they were taking a whole bunch of components and putting them around Linux. So they ended up calling the whole thing a Linux system, and somehow that term caught on. And the result is there are now 10 million people using this variant of the GNU system, the GNU/Linux operating system, and most of them don't know it.
Some people advocate that it be described as GNU/Linux. I mean, what's your thought on that? Is that justified, or?
Well, I think it's justified, but it's justified if you actually make a GNU distribution of Linux. The same way that I think that Red Hat Linux is fine, or SUSE Linux, or Debian Linux. Because if you actually make your own distribution of Linux, you get to name the thing. But calling Linux in general GNU Linux, I think, is just ridiculous. I came to the US about 3 years ago. And the reason really was that I'd been spending like 6 or 7 years at Helsinki University and decided that it was time to see the real world and not just university life. Especially this area had a lot of the most interesting work being done. So I just decided that let's try to move halfway across the world and give this a try. And it's turned out pretty well.
Do you see this as temporary or long-term?
Well, we saw it as temporary at first, and I think it's certainly looking like it's turning long-term. Our youngest daughter is both a US and a Finnish citizen because she was born here, and the older one is speaking both Swedish and English, so... The local user groups tend to be more an issue of building a social network, especially getting people familiarized with the issues, also just acting as a kind of support network for people who do not, for example, have the ability to pay for a commercial support network. So one thing they're doing in this area, for example, is they're making these, I think it's once a month, they're having install fests, which means that people who have problems getting Linux installed on their machine or have some issue, I mean, maybe they've actually installed Linux but want to set up the network in a specific way, can actually bring in their machines to this users group meeting. And there's a lot of people that are willing to help who've maybe seen that problem before.
You know, when I was a kid and I went to school, the teachers were trying to teach us to share. They said if you bring some candy, you can't eat it all yourself, you've got to share it with the other kids. But now the administration says teachers should be teaching kids to say yes to licensing. If you bring some software to school, oh no, don't share it. Sharing means you're a pirate. Sharing means you'll be put in jail. That's not the way society should work. We need the goodwill, the willingness to help other people, at least when it's not too hard, because that's the basis of society. That's the fundamental resource that gives us a society instead of a dog-eat-dog jungle. But actually, let me tell you how we got here. See, what happened is, 15 years ago, if you wanted to use a computer, the only way you could do it was with proprietary software that divides and subjugates the users. And most people a lot of people didn't like it, but they saw no alternative. But some of us were determined to make an alternative, and we said we're going to develop a free operating system, a free software operating system that will give users the chance to have freedom while they use their computers. Now, a lot of people said, well, it's a nice idea, but it's so hard, we'll never get it done, so I don't want to participate. I don't believe you can ever get it done. But luckily, not everybody said that. And clearly, we knew we would eventually get the kernel done. But as it happens, somebody else did a better kernel before we did. Now, in the old days, we had an overall strategy for calling people's attention to the importance of freedom, to the freedom that they can have or not have when they use a computer. Well, what can we do about it? As far as I can tell, the only workable way of trying to change this and make that strategy work again is to spread the word that the operating system you're using is actually the GNU system, somewhat modified, of course. And when people know this, they'll take a look at the reasons we developed this system, they'll think about these issues, and some of them will decide they agree. So I ask people, please tell people this is the GNU system. It's the combination of GNU and Linux, so we can call it GNU/Linux.
So how do you feel about potentially billions of dollars of wealth being created from your creation, but you're not necessarily directly cashing out?
So if I hadn't made Linux available, I mean, I wouldn't have gotten any money that way either. So I mean, it's a win-win situation. Just the fact that there are a lot of commercial companies means that there are a lot of Linux people who used to work on Linux kind of on the side. And now they get paid for doing what they wanted to do. And that helps me in the sense that I wanted them to work on Linux anyway.
The whole GNU project is really one big hack. It's one big act of subversive, playful cleverness to change society for the better, because I'm only interested in changing it for the better, but in a clever way.
Hi, we're the GNU Stallmans, and this is the free software song. Join us now and share the software. You'll be free, hackers, you'll be free.